Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The candles in the great hall flickered as Harry Potter stood alone in the Hogwarts library. It had been over a decade since the Battle of Hogwarts, and the once young hero had grown into a powerful wizard. The years in the Allure office had hardened him, but the spirit of curiosity never left him. Tonight, that curiosity had led him deep into the restricted section of the library, where dusty tomes, long forgotten, whispered their ancient secrets. He had come to Hogwarts at the request of his longtime friend, Hermione Granger, now the headmistress of the school. Hermione, ever the researcher, had stumbled upon rumors of powerful ancient magic hidden within the bowels of the castle's archives. When Harry's investigation brought him to a particular book at the Chronomagus Grimoire, he couldn't resist diving into its worn pages. The leather cover was cracked, the parchment fragile, but the words glowed faintly, as if imbued with a life of their own. Harry's finger traced the text, his mind unraveling the meaning behind the cryptic script. Then, suddenly, without warning, the air around him grew dense. The book's magic surged to life, and a swirling vortex of energy appeared, wrapping itself around Harry. He gasped, trying to pull away, but it was too late. The library vanished, replaced by a blinding light. When the world finally settled, Harry found himself standing on the familiar grounds of Hogwarts, but something was wrong. The landscape, though the same, had a strange, old-world quality to it, as though it had been pulled from the past. Panic surged through him. Had the spell sent him back in time? He hurried inside the castle, heart pounding. Students, dressed in robes with a slightly older design than he remembered, bustled through the corridors. His heart dropped when he recognized the faces of people he knew had long since passed. Professors, students, everyone was younger, too young. He had traveled back to a time long before his own. As Harry moved through the castle, his fears were confirmed. A glimpse of a younger Albus Dumbledore, barely in his middle years, and a a shadowy figure lurking near the slithering common room sent chills down his spine. It was Tom Riddle. Voldemort, in his youth. The gravity of the situation hit him hard. He wasn't just in the past, he was in that past. Forcing himself to remain calm, Harry ducked into a quiet corridor, the walls feeling unnaturally close around him. His mind raced. He couldn't afford to alter anything. Time travel, especially in the magical world, was fraught with peril. Every action he took could have unforeseen consequences. He needed to find a way back to his time without disrupting the timeline. But how? The only person Harry felt he could trust, who could help him without fully revealing his identity, was Dumbledore. But even Dumbledore might be suspicious of a stranger with such advanced magical knowledge. No, Harry thought, he would need to proceed carefully. In this era, Dumbledore wasn't the revered headmaster Harry had known. He was still a brilliant, but less cautious professor. As Harry began to form a plan, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something dark was at play here. The vortex hadn't just sent him back accidentally, there was intent behind it. Dark magic had a hand in this, and Harry had a sinking suspicion that someone had manipulated time to alter history. In the days that followed, Harry carefully navigated the halls of Hogwarts, keeping a low profile. His presence was unknown, and he intended to keep it that way. Disguising himself with a series of charms and borrowing a simple robe from a house elf, he blended into the student body as best he could, keeping his head down and his wand close. However, despite his precautions, it wasn't long before his path crossed with two figures whose destinies would forever shape the future of the wizarding world: young Tom Riddle and a suspiciously sharp-eyed Albus Dumbledore. Harry first encountered Tom in the library, hunched over ancient texts much like Harry himself had been just days ago. Riddle looked up, catching Harry's eye, and for a fleeting moment, Harry felt the icy chill of recognition. The boy in the monster in waiting seemed to sense something was different about Harry, though he couldn't possibly know what. Not yet, at least. But that look, dark and penetrating, left Harry uneasy. Later, in the Great Hall, Harry saw Dumbledore, this version of him, much younger and perhaps less burdened by the weight of future battles. Even now, there was a sharpness in Dumbledore's gaze, a hint that he was more aware of things than he let on. As Harry sat quietly, unnoticed by most of the students, Dumbledore's eyes occasionally flickered in his direction. Was it suspicion, or merely curiosity? It wasn't long before Dumbledore confronted him in the library late one night. "You're not from here, are you?" Dumbledore said, his voice low and unthreatening, but undeniably knowing. Harry's heart raced. He had prepared for this, but it still sent a shock through him to be recognized, even in this subtle way. "What makes you say that?" Harry replied, keeping his voice calm. "There's something about you, a broken bar, something not quite right," Dumbledore said, studying him closely. "You carry a burden from a time not yet written." Harry exhaled slowly. He couldn't tell Dumbledore everything, it would be too dangerous. But he needed help. Carefully, he began to explain, offering just enough of the truth to earn Dumbledore's trust without risking the timeline. He told him he had come from a distant future, a future where Voldemort Tom Riddle would rise to power, and that dark forces were trying to manipulate time to ensure that future played out differently. Dumbledore listened quietly, his blue eyes sharp and thoughtful. When Harry finished, the professor stood in silence for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back. "I believe you," Dumbledore finally said, his voice steady but grave. "Time is a delicate thing, m'ra broken bar." "Potter," Harry replied, realizing too late that the name would likely set off alarms in Dumbledore's mind. Dumbledore raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, he gestured toward the ancient bookshelves behind them. "If someone is trying to alter time, they are meddling with forces they cannot fully understand. We must be very careful." Harry nodded, relieved that Dumbledore was on his side. But even with his help, the path ahead seemed more dangerous than ever. As the days passed, Harry continued his covert investigation, with Dumbledore subtly assisting where he could. The dark magic Harry had sensed upon his arrival only grew stronger. The magical disturbances were in Trandom, as someone was deliberately trying to influence key events at Hogwarts. Harry suspected that a dark wizard from the future, perhaps a former Death Eater, had also traveled back in time and was attempting to manipulate young Tom Riddle, pushing him further down the path of darkness. Late one evening, Harry's suspicions were confirmed. He overheard a whispered conversation between two shadowy figures in the dungeons beneath the castle. One voice was unmistakably Tom Riddle's, the other, a voice Harry didn't recognize, older, darker, and filled with malice. "They say the magic in this castle is ancient," the older voice whispered. "But there are spells even the founders never dared touch. You will master them, Tom, and when the time is right, you will become more powerful than any wizard has ever been." Riddle's reply was cold and calculating. "And what of the others?" "Dumbledore, and that strange student who seems to know more than he should? They will be dealt with. Leave them to me." Harry's blood ran cold. Whoever this dark wizard was, they were plotting to eliminate Dumbledore and possibly him as well. The following morning, Harry sought out Dumbledore in secret. Together, they devised a plan to expose the dark wizard and stop the plot before it could take root. It wouldn't be easy. Time magic was notoriously difficult to reverse, and the danger of altering the future loomed over every decision they made. Their first priority was to uncover the identity of the mysterious figure working with Tom Riddle. Harry had a theory, though it chilled him to his core. If a Death Eater had used time magic to come back and ensure Voldemort's rise, the implications for the future were terrifying. Every action, every spell, could shift the course of history. But Harry knew one thing for sure: if Riddle gained access to the forbidden spells being whispered in the dark, the future would be far worse than even Harry could imagine. He and Dumbledore set a trap that night, deep in the Forbidden Forest where dark creatures roamed and ancient magic flowed beneath the earth. There, they waited for their quarry, hoping to lure the dark wizard into the open. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows through the trees. Every rustle of leaves sent a shiver down Harry's spine. But they didn't have to wait long. The forest grew unnaturally still as Harry and Dumbledore waited in the shadows. The rustling of the leaves, the low hum of the night creatures, all seemed to vanish into a tense, oppressive silence. Dumbledore's wand was out, though barely visible under his cloak, the tip glowing faintly with readiness. Harry's pulse quickened, his grip tightening on his own wand. He had faced dark wizards before, but never under circumstances like this. He was no longer a boy fighting against a known enemy, he was a man battling time itself. A figure emerged from the thick fog that had crept into the forest, moving with deliberate, careful steps. He was cloaked, his face hidden beneath the hood, but Harry could feel the familiar dark energy rolling off him in waves. This wasn't just any wizard, this was someone who had dabbled in the darkest magic, someone who had no qualms about twisting the natural order of things to serve their purpose. Beside him, the shadowy form of Tom Riddle appeared, his face young but eyes cold, far too old for the boy he was supposed to be. Dumbledore's eyes flashed toward Harry, giving the briefest nod. The plan was simple but dangerous. Let the dark wizard reveal himself, let him make the first move. They needed to learn who this person was and how far they had come to alter time. And then, they would strike. As the figures drew closer, Harry heard the dark wizard speak, his voice deep, filled with malice and cruel intent. Tonight is the night, Tom. We will tap into the ancient magics buried beneath this forest. I will show you what even your precious Hogwarts hides from its students. Once you harness this power, no Onia, especially Dumbledore, will stand in your way. Tom's reply was cold and sharp. Dumbledore underestimates me. He's a broken bar stranger. This student is of more concern. He is not what he seems. Harry's heart jumped. Tom was talking about him. The dark wizard's head tilted slightly as though considering this, but he didn't stop moving toward the clearing where Harry and Dumbledore lay hidden. That one is of no consequence. When the ritual is complete, he will be dealt with. Harry's mind raced. The ritual, they were talking about it. If they succeeded, they could imbue Tom with power far beyond what he would have in the future. If that happened, the timeline would be shattered beyond repair. They couldn't let this go any further. Before Harry could act, Dumbledore moved first, his wand flicking upward with such speed that the air around it crackled. I think not, he said calmly, stepping into the open. The figure of the dark wizard froze, his hood shifting slightly as if in recognition. Albus Dumbledore, he hissed, his voice lowering into something more dangerous. Always meddling where you don't belong. Harry stepped out as well, wand at the ready. His eyes locked on Riddle's, and for a brief second, they held each other's gaze. Young as he was, Tom already had the unmistakable presence of Voldemort, the cold detachment, the calculated malice. Harry could see it in his eyes, the darkness that would consume him in years to come. Enough of this, the dark wizard growled. He threw off his cloak, revealing himself at last. Harry's stomach dropped as the figure came into full view. It was a face he recognized, though much older, more twisted by time and dark magic. Adolov, a Death Eater from Harry's future. How had he traveled back? Why? Dolorov's wand snapped up, sending a blast of energy toward Dumbledore, but the professor deflected it easily with a flick of his wrist. The spell ricocheted off into the trees, causing branches to crack and fall. Riddle stepped back, his eyes wide with interest, watching the two wizards duel with a kind of dark fascination. He was absorbing every moment, every flicker of magic, preparing himself for the path he knew he would one day take. Harry darted to the side, his one already casting defensive charms. He had faced Olaf before, but not in this way, not as someone who could now manipulate time and alter the course of history. The stakes were higher. One mistake, one misstep, and the future would crumble into something far darker. Dumbledore's spells grew more intricate, more powerful as the duel intensified. Doloov was skilled, but Harry could see the cracks in his confidence. He hadn't expected Dumbledore to be here, hadn't anticipated that Harry would be more than just an anonymous threat. "You can't win," Dumbledore said, his voice calm even as he cast another spell that sent Olaf stumbling back. "Time has a way of correcting itself." "You think you can stop me?" Olaf snarled. "I've seen the future. I know what happens. Voldemort falls because of him." He jabbed his wand toward Harry. "But not this time. This time, I'll make sure you never even get the chance to fight him." Before Harry could react, Olaf whipped his wand toward him, casting a spell so dark that Harry could feel the air around him freeze. His instincts took over, and he cast a shield charm just in time. The curse hit his shield, but the force of it sent him staggering back. Riddle, meanwhile, had not moved. He was observing, calculating. Harry realized with a chill that this was a turning point for him. If he witnessed this duel, if he saw Harry as an unknown, powerful enemy, it might change his entire path toward becoming Voldemort. The future was hanging by a thread. But they couldn't stop now. Dumbledore advanced, pressing Olaf back with a barrage of spells, each one more precise than the last. Harry circled around, keeping his wand trained on Riddle, though he couldn't bring himself to attack him not yet. There was still a chance, however slim, that this version of Riddle hadn't fully embraced the darkness. Then, in a moment of sheer desperation, Olaf raised his wand high and shouted a spell Harry had never heard before. The air around them crackled, and for a second, everything froze. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Harry felt his body tense as though he was being pulled apart by invisible forces. "No!" Dumbledore shouted, and with a blinding flash of light, he countered the spell. Olaf screamed as the energy of the spell backfired, engulfing him in a twisting vortex of light and shadow. The force of it lifted him off the ground, and with one final, agonizing scream, he vanished. The spell, meant to twist time, had consumed him. The silence that followed was deafening. The forest, once filled with dark magic, now seemed eerily calm. The trees whispered again, as if nothing had happened. Harry stood still, breathing heavily, his wand still raised. Dumbledore lowered his own wand slowly, watching the spot where Olaf had disappeared. There was no satisfaction in his face, only a deep weariness. "Is it over?" Harry asked, his voice quiet. "For now," Dumbledore replied, his eyes shifting to Tom Riddle, who had remained eerily still throughout the entire battle. "But time has a way of correcting itself." Riddle's gaze flickered between Harry and Dumbledore, something unreadable in his young eyes. For a moment, Harry thought he saw curiosity, perhaps even a hint of respect. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the cold indifference that Harry had come to associate with the Dark Lord. Without another word, Riddle turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Harry and Dumbledore stood in silence for a long moment. "He'll still become Voldemort, won't he?" Harry finally asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," Dumbledore said softly. "But the future is not yet written in stone. Your presence here, while dangerous, may have given him pause. Only time will tell." Harry nodded, though the weight of what had just happened hung heavily on his shoulders. He had come back to protect the future, and yet the future remained as uncertain as ever. They returned to the castle in silence, both of them lost in thought. When they reached the gates of Hogwarts, Dumbledore stopped and placed a hand on Harry's shoulder. "You've done well, Harry. Far more than anyone could have asked of you." Harry smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I just hope I didn't do more harm than good." Dumbledore's expression softened. "That is the burden we all carry. But remember, the future is always changing. It is shaped by our choices, our actions, and sometimes, our mistakes." As they parted ways, Harry felt the familiar pull of time magic stirring around him. The spell that had brought him to the past was calling him back. He took one last look at the castle, at the place where his past and future had collided, and then, with a surge of magic, he was gone. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the Hogwarts library, the ancient tome lying closed on the table before him. The air was still, as if nothing had changed. But Harry knew better. Time had shifted, however imperceptibly, and the future remained uncertain. But for now, at least, it was safe.